Hello, I am Fabio Parasecoli, the coordinator of the Food Studies program at the New School, and I'm here at the James Beard House with the James Beard Foundation president, Susan Ungaro.
I'm so happy that you're here and that we're going to be talking about our favorite subject, James Beard.
Thank you for having us. So, in this course, we're trying to introduce different innovators of American cuisine, and of course, we decided to have James Beard, who's one of the big important ones. So we wanted to know a little more about him, something about his life, but also about the time he lived in. Why was he innovative? What did he bring to American cuisines? And what's his legacy? So let's start by talking about him.
Okay. Well, we're sitting under a beautiful portrait of James Beard by George Rada, taken of him holding asparagus. His two favorite things to eat would be roast chicken and asparagus. And he was a man who really celebrated American cuisine. But he was born in Portland, Oregon. I think a lot of people don't know that. Born in 1903. So that's 110 years ago.
Okay.
He would have been 110. He was born in Portland. His mother divorced when he was young. She ran a boarding house in Portland. Her name was Elizabeth Gladstone Beard. And she ran a boarding house called the Gladstone. And so she was always cooking and entertaining all of the people who lived in her boarding house. And she actually, James Beard talked about, that's really where he developed his taste memory. I think even those words, coining the words taste memory, probably came from him. He talked about, he used to be in the kitchen. They had a Chinese cook named Let, L-E-T, Let, and he learned a lot about cooking from him, and he learned to love Chinese cooking as well, which he used to decorate this townhouse. We're actually sitting here in the fourth floor of a brownstone in Greenwich Village, New York, where James Beard lived the last 15 or so years of his life.
And how did he get into food? I mean, was it his first call, or did he have different careers?
Well, he really wanted to be an opera singer or on Broadway. And he was an only child, no siblings, probably spoiled to a degree. And his mother definitely wanted to indulge his passions, and singing was one of them, along with food. He actually went off to France, and he studied there for a while. He definitely got voice lessons. He went to Reed College in Oregon, and he did get some parts singing in local small productions. But like so many aspiring singers and actors, he moved to New York City in the 1940s, or late 1930s, hoping to make an acting career, sing here on Broadway or at the opera. And like so many struggling actors in New York, he ended up in the food business. You might wonder how. They say that he actually cooked for Cecil B. DeMille. But he also, because when he wasn't able to really make it on Broadway, he started doing cocktail parties for actors and for people running Broadway shows. They say he basically became the king of the cocktail party at first. And he actually succeeded so well in a little business that he decided to do a cookbook called Hors d'oeuvres and Canapés in 1940. And that was his first cookbook.
Okay. How was food in America at the time? What kind of food would people eat, and how does it fit in his story?
Well, clearly he was in this city at a time when processed foods were becoming more and more popular. People were talking about how do they spend less time in the kitchen. It wasn't really the art form that it has certainly become in the past 20 years in terms of that. Now people are, it is a benefit. It is a self-esteem issue to be able to say, I can cook up a great meal in the kitchen. That wasn't so really in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s and 70s. He really, I think, succeeded because even the idea of hors d'oeuvres and canapes was something that was a little bit artistic, worked with that art community. He really carved a niche for himself in terms of teaching people that there's more to just food than, opening up a frozen TV dinner, a can of, beans and tuna. He really was somebody who loved the art of making everything from fresh produce. And I think he learned that partly because of his heritage growing up in Portland, Oregon.
Oh. And so he became famous doing these canapes, these parties.
Yes.
How did he move from that to, other forms of food?
Right. Well, he succeeded. That first cookbook was a big success, and he wrote another cookbook just like a year later on cooking it outdoors. It might have been the first barbecue cookbook in the United States. He brought a sensibility about cooking that was really not common yet in the 50s and 60s. He was the first person to really talk about cooking with fresh ingredients. And he brought that from his upbringing, actually, in Portland, Oregon. He also often talked about longing for the days of, living in the Northwest where everything was fresh, where, from the seafood to the Bing cherries to all of the vegetables and fruits that he could get and cook in season. He often said that the best ingredients are the fresh ones. So, he comes to New York City, doesn't make it in acting, and he starts really a new career carved out as a cookbook author and as a teacher. So he started teaching classes, writing cookbooks, writing articles for magazines, and he really became quite famous by the 1950s and 60s. He started appearing on radio shows and TV. He had one of the first cooking shows long before everybody knows about the Galloping Gourmet and Julia Child and the Frugal Gourmet. James Beard had a cooking show called I Love to Eat on NBC.
I love to eat.
I love to eat. And there's some great. We've got a few videos that we have of him, black and white videos, hosting basically an hour-long show where he sits with a group of 1940s, 50s ladies around a living room talking about food, and then going into the kitchen and making and demonstrating, how to roast a chicken, how to make pasta, how to make a salad, and how to entertain. So he was probably, in a way, he was long before Martha Stewart too, if you think about that. We have some wonderful videos of him on the Today Show on NBC with a young Bryant Gumbel and a young Tom Brokaw in the kitchen here at the Beard House, teaching Bryant Gumbel how to make homemade pasta. And it's really quite a hilarious episode because, he's the dough and the water and, says mix it with your hands. And Bryant Gumbel doesn't really want to touch the dough. And, he asks him a question like, is it really true that if once you've made the pasta and boiled it, when you throw it at the wall and it sticks, is it done? And he laughs and he says, that's not really true. Taste it. So he was talking about the real secrets of cooking in the kitchen, not just shortcuts, but the art of cookery long before anybody else was on TV. Tom Brokaw, teaching Tom Brokaw how to make a roast chicken. I mean, a lot of great stuff.
And was he a good teacher? It sounds like he was teaching lots of people.
Well, the Beard House here, we have a kitchen, which is the kitchen where he taught cooking classes. He used to sit on a high director's chair in the middle of a U-shaped island butcher block counter and teach about a dozen students. We have photos of those two, where he would teach them everything they needed to know about how to make a great salad using, just whatever people really wanted to learn, how to entertain without stress. He was somebody who I think really said to people, don't be afraid to cook. That it's, processed cooking is not the way to to anyone's heart. When you want to entertain your guests, keep it simple, use fresh ingredients. And he eventually became known as the godfather of American cuisine. And, you might say, how did that happen? Well, word got out. He was writing all these cookbooks. He wrote 24 cookbooks during his lifetime. And so between, his authority as a magazine columnist, a cookbook author, a teacher, and somebody who was on television quite regularly, he was someone who eventually started mentoring chefs and working with restaurateurs. One of the most famous restaurants he worked on was the Four Seasons here in New York City. Back in the late 1950s, Joseph Baum, who created many great iconic restaurants, came to James Beard because he wore so many hats. He was a restaurant consultant along with everything else. And he asked him, I just bought this beautiful building, Philip Johnson building, and I want to create a restaurant. What should I do? I want you to help me. And James Beard said, well, make it anything but French. You laugh, because if you think about it, in the 1950s, and certainly before that, and in the 60s, the only really great fancy restaurants in New York City, and perhaps in most of the country, were French. And he said, make it an American restaurant, a thoroughly American restaurant where the menu changes with the seasons. And let's call it the Four Seasons. And, by the way, let's not just serve fine French wines and European wines. Let's serve American wines from the Northwest, Pinot Noirs from Oregon.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. And if you think about it, the Four Seasons restaurant still is one of the most iconic, most admired restaurants here in New York City and in the country. And they have never changed that foundation. It's still called the Four Seasons. The menu changes with the seasons. And everything is about cooking in a thoroughly American way.
And at the time, was he already living in this house? When did he move here?
He would have been living in another house in the village, and then he moved here in the late 1970s, early 1970s. He moved here in 1973.
Okay, so when he was already famous, on TV, consultant.
He was a figure in the Greenwich Village. He just lived in another place in the village. He was somebody that everybody, you couldn't miss James Beard. He was 6'3", a very large sized man, large feet, large hands. In fact, I love the fact that Judith Jones, who was his editor on many of his cookbooks, said that he used to say, "Your hands are the best utensils." And he was somebody who, was really known in the village for just always, being stopped on the street. He had a listed phone number. He never had his phone number unlisted. So he loved talking on the phone. And he received calls from people, anybody could call him if they looked up his number, and he would help them with, having trouble with a recipe in maybe one of his cookbooks. He was legend for that.
He would answer.
He would answer the phone, and he would talk to you or me or anyone who might call up and say, I need some advice, or, I think he probably came before the Butterball Turkey hotline.